Peace family, y'all know who it is. It's Dr. Picard K. Lumumba, the progenitor of LumumbaSpeaks.com, a Black empowerment initiative where we believe we could gain a competitive advantage by always betting on Black in conjunction with B. Colon Network, the Pan-African social media extraordinaire, and the home of African-centered news and information. And we're here to give you once again a great show where we're going to be discussing, I think, about a provocative but important question, and that is, do African people suffer from Stockholm syndrome? Many of you are unaware of what Stockholm syndrome is. We will touch base on that. I see we already got some discussions in the comments, so definitely appreciate people tapping in, being part of the conversation. But before we do that, family, I want to bring your attention to an issue that's going on right now, right, on the African continent. That is in Togo, right? We have sister, one of the preeminent Pan-Africans on the continent, Sister Farida Namborema. She's an activist from Togo, and she's been fighting for years against an oppressive military regime in Togo. Many of you are unaware of where Togo is located. Family is in West Africa, Francophone nation. And of course, there's a, a protest going on right now to remove that regime from, of course, power and create a democratic government in Togo. So if you could, brothers and sisters, follow Sister Farida on Twitter, as she's asked us to do. Please come witness change in Togo. We are determined to bring down the oldest military regime in Africa peacefully. Help us win our struggle by sharing the video of today's protest. So if you go on and follow Sister Farida, then of course share the protest that's taking place. Of course, this was penned in 2018, but there have been numerous protests that have taken place since then, even of course today. And of course, we want you to support our brothers and sisters in Togo. As many of you are aware, we've shared on our platform the Water Filters Initiative for Togo, our Togolese brothers and sisters. This is another way that we can support our brothers and sisters, peacefully bringing in a democratic government where, of course, the individuals who are in power, who run the nation, are working on behalf of the people of Togo. So just want to, once again, family, if you can, follow Sister Farida Bemba Namborema on Twitter, now known as X. And also, family, if you're watching, make sure you like, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for future videos. Once again, you're watching LumumbaSpeaks.com, a Black empowerment initiative where we believe you can gain a competitive advantage by always betting on Black in conjunction with B. Colon Network, the Pan-African social media extraordinaire, and the home of African-centered news and information. Once again, if you could be a blessing to the show, of course, Cash App us at Lumumba Speaks or Venmo at B Lumumba. And of course, you can always hit the super chat to be a blessing to the show so that we could continue to bring you not only an African-centered perspective, but of course, this is, of course, independent Black media that targets Black people, that centers Black people, and the conversations that we seek to have to make a better world for African people. So with that being said, family, the link is in the description. I'm quite sure you are aware, and the link is in the chat. So I want you to tap in, be part of the conversation. And the question is, do African people suffer from Stockholm syndrome? I argue that we do on a macro level, on a global level. We do suffer, unfortunately, from Stockholm syndrome. And part of that, I think, is due in part to this concept that Charles Wright calls the racial contract, right? So many of you are aware, you probably tapped in when I defended my dissertation on the channel. And one of the things that I discussed in my dissertation was this concept of the racial contract. As many of us know, the racial contract stems from, of course, this concept and idea of white hegemony, right? And part of that, part of the goal of the racial contract is to, is to envelop the victims of the racial contract to become actual defenders of its cause, right? And so this is something that we're going to look at. It's this concept of not only the racial contract, but Mills actually argues the contract, according to Mills, is a set of informal agreements among whites to privilege themselves as a group through domination, exploitation, and of non-whites as a group. The racial contract, he argues, is divided between persons and, of course, racial sub-persons. We know, due to, of course, the racialized nature of colonialism and chattel enslavement, African people were considered sub-persons, right? But Mills goes on to argue that part of the racial contract is that the goal is to manipulate, right, the minds of African people to become defenders of its cause, right? And so that's where I believe the concept and idea of Stockholm syndrome comes in. So many of you are unaware of Stockholm syndrome. That is the argument. It took place, I believe, in the 1970s, where there were some individuals who tried to rob a bank. They held some people hostage. And when the hostages were actually freed, they refused to testify against their captors. They actually sought to provide support, even raise money for the captors' defense, right? So this is where the concept Stockholm syndrome derives from. I argue in some ways that Black people may suffer, of course, from this concept of Stockholm syndrome. So particularly in terms of our desire to identify with, of course, the views, ideas. Sister Shy, appreciate you, Sister, tapping in. Hopefully you could be part of the conversation. I would love to hear what you have to say. Once again, your opinion is always welcome. And as you know, you do not have to cam up to be part of the show. The link is in the description. Of course, I'll put the link in the chat momentarily. But this concept and idea of seeking to identify with, or at least be in proximity with, those who have oppressed us, right? Right. We talk about the non-Black other, for lack of better words, right? This concept and idea that our progression as a people is based on our proximity to, or a relationship with, those who have done a significant cultural, historical, and even political and economic harm. Brother Haru, peace and blessings. Appreciate you, brother. Hopefully you could tap in and be part of the conversation. So we really want to unpack this concept of not only the racial contract, but how, of course, that aligns with this concept of Stockholm syndrome. And what can we do to, of course, address this issue, right? Mills talks about, of course, the racial contract is the ideological conditioning that comes as a result of the racial contract. He argues that it seeks to envelop the victims of the contract into willing participants and defenders of its cause, right? He argues that this is a depersonalizing apparatus through which whites learn to see non-whites and whites learn to see themselves, with the goal of non-white subjugation, self-loathing, and racial deference to whites. I'm quite sure many of us, I see, Brother Hu, you're saying my answer is yes, 100% yes. Wonderful, right? So my hope and desire is that, you all could tap in, just have this conversation. Why do you believe this is the case? And then let's move forward in terms of what are some solutions, right? We want to be solution oriented, right? To how do we solve this issue of Stockholm syndrome in the African community, the global African community? So family, the link is in the description. The link is in the chat. Tap in and be part of the conversation. I saw a comment earlier. Lead Guitarist 94 says, yes, we do. Think about it. As a people, we had 400 years of chattel slavery, then another 160 years of Jim Crow and oppression, all without being able to reverse the effects of it. Appreciate you, brother. 244 years of chattel enslavement. 244 years of chattel enslavement here, and of course, the United States of America. But tap in, family, be part of the conversation. Would love to hear what you all have to say regarding, do African people globally suffer from Stockholm syndrome? Please provide some examples that you believe is why we suffer from Stockholm syndrome. Then, of course, let's have a conversation about regarding what would be solutions. We will always want to be solution oriented to the issue of course, Stockholm syndrome. So tap in, family. The link is in the description. The link is in the chat. I'm looking forward to hearing from you all, and let's have a conversation. Also, as family, as you all know, you do not have to cam up. Keyword, you do not have to cam up, and you do not have to use your actual name. You can use a pseudonym to be part of the conversation to protect your identity. So tap in, family, be part of the convo. I've kind of given my perspective, my position, of course, linking the concept of the racial contract, the work of Charles Mills, of course, with the concept of an idea of Stockholm syndrome. I focus on this concept, the ideological conditioning, right, in which, of course, we see this non-white self-subjugation, self-loathing, and, of course, racial deference to whites. Gloria Coleman says, probably. Appreciate you, Sister Gloria. Tap in, be part of the convo. Once again, you do not have to cam up to be part of the conversation, and you can use the pseudonym to protect your identity. Would love to hear what you have to say regarding why you believe Black people, African people suffer from Stockholm syndrome? And then, of course, number two, what are some solutions to, of course, what I'll argue is the psychological or ideological conditioning that we suffer from that causes us to actually engage in the practices that are associated with Stockholm syndrome. So tap in, family. The link is in the description. The link is in the chat. And let's have a conversation today regarding, of course, Stockholm syndrome in the global, keyword global African community, global African community. So looking forward to hearing from you all here on Friday, June 6th. As you all know, Father's Day is coming up. We're going to do a show on Father's Day, honoring Black men, Black African men who are fathers. Oftentimes we are not, keyword, are not made aware of it. Oftentimes we find, due to, of course, the omnipresent role of course, feminist ideology, there's a diminishing of course, Black men as fathers. But we're going to push back against that. Also, family, just want to let you all know today's Black History Fact is on this day in 1966, Kwame Ture, at that moment known as Stokely Carmichael, launched the Black Power movement. Right, that's when he dropped the bomb when they were in Mississippi and said, "I think it was Greenwood, Mississippi," and said, "We're going to advocate for Black Power and what we want Black Power. And when do we want it? We want it now." So, give a shout out to the great ancestor, Pan-Africanist, the man who was once considered the Prime Minister of African America. That is, of course, Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, of course, Trinidad and Tobago born. Howard University, Bronx, New York raised, Howard University educated, of course, Pan-Africanist. So definitely want to give a shout out there. We have Kevin, Brother Kevin, aka Mr. K, states, absolutely yes. A prime example. Look at how Black people still hold on to these non-African religions that were brutally imposed upon the ancestors in historical times. Great point, Brother K, Mr. K. Tap in and be part of the conversation. I would love for you to expound on that, because I would agree with you, but I think oftentimes what happens is, and this is just my perspective, someone who grew up, of course, in an Abrahamic religious institution, is typically you're enveloped at an early age when you're a child, where you do not have the capacity to ask those type of incisive questions in terms of how to become in contact with this religion or faith. And then what happens is you have individuals who are adults who still aren't aware, unfortunately, of the history. So definitely tap in, Brother Kevin. The link is in the description, links in the chat. Black Canadian 93 says, I would say some Black Canadians suffer from Stockholm syndrome to an extent. Some of us up here in Canada have a anything white is right mentality. So Black Canadian, I need you to tap in, be part of the conversation as well. Once again, we are a Pan-Africanist channel, so we need that global perspective, not an African-American perspective, but a global African perspective. So I'd love to hear from a brother who is, of course, our northern neighbor. As I shared with you before, I went to Toronto for my birthday last year. So I'd love to hear from you, brother. Tap in, be part of the conversation. The link is in the description. The link is in the chat. And as you know, you do not, keyword, you do not have to cam. You don't have to cam up. You don't have to cam up. And of course, you can use a pseudonym to protect your identity. So definitely would love to hear from Black Canadian, aka Mr. Kevin, aka Mr. K. Gloria, tap in, be part of the convo. And of course, Sister Shy, we want you to tap in, be part of the conversation as well as lead guitarists. We always believe that the more individuals who tap in, the better conversation we can have and the more that we can grow. And of course, we also want to be solution oriented. So the question is, how do we, keyword, how do we overcome Stockholm syndrome? How do we prevent it from taking place? How do we help our brothers and sisters who may be suffering from this psychological disorder that many of us would argue as a result of trauma, PTSD, and even some would even argue maybe racial battle fatigue. So tap in, family. The link is in the description. The link is in the chat. We'd love to hear from you all regarding, do we suffer from Stockholm syndrome as a people? Then how do we, keyword, how do we, of course, overcome Stockholm syndrome? What are some solutions? How do we heal from this, of course, trauma-induced psychosis that seeks to, that we can argue, it has enveloped the overwhelming majority of our people? So I'd love to hear from you, family. The link, once again, is in the description. The link is in the chat. Tap in, be part of the conversation. We're discussing, do African people suffer from Stockholm Syndrome, here at LumumbaSpeaks.com, a Black Empowerment Initiative where we believe we can gain a competitive advantage by always betting on Black, in conjunction with Bequan Network, the Pan-African social media extraordinaire, and the home of African-centered news and information. And please be a blessing to the show. You can hit us Cash App at Lumumba Speaks, on Venmo, of course, at B Lumumba. Then, of course, you can always, hit the super chat as well. So definitely looking forward to hearing from you all, family. Be part of the conversation. We're discussing, do African people suffer from Stockholm Syndrome? Do we suffer from Stockholm Syndrome? That is the question. So, AK Mr. K says, just curious, are you familiar with the organization called Association of Black Psychologists and its publication, Journal of Black Psychology? That's a great question, brother Mr. K. Not only am I familiar with the association and the journal, I'm actually friends with a number of Black psychologists who are members of the ABP. So absolutely, brother. But tap in, be part of the conversation. Yes, but I am familiar with the Association of Black Psychologists. I have a number of their books and journals. And of course, I cited a lot of their work, well, a lot of articles from the journal in my dissertation. So definitely appreciate the question, brother. Absolutely. And of course, they would make the argument that, yes, we do suffer from Stockholm Syndrome. They would be rather resolute, of course, in their position, arguing that we suffer from Stockholm Syndrome and that many of these psychological issues that African people face, not only on the continent, but even in the diaspora, irrespective if you are here in the Western world, if you're here in the New World, what's considered the New World, or even, of course, in Europe or even parts of Asia and Polynesia, is based on, of course, the oppression that we faced as a people. Many are maybe familiar with this concept and idea of colonial mentality, where often, unfortunately, many former colonial subjects. I see you, brother, Black Canadian. I appreciate you camming up in queue just to make sure you're not trolling. I'm going to bring you in momentarily. But one of the issues we tend to find is that, unfortunately, based on that conditioning that is ideological, that is psychological, we could even argue also that is pedagogical, right? We tend to oftentimes have this inferiority complex that manifests itself in this concept of course, racial deference and self-loathing. So definitely appreciate that question, brother Kevin. What's the word?
Hey, Lumumba, how's it going?
I'm doing quite all right. How are you?
Doing pretty good, man.
Wonderful. Let me ask you this question, if you don't mind me asking. What part of Canada are you in?
Oh, so I was born and raised in Toronto.
Okay.
My parents are Jamaican immigrants, but they came here a long time ago. Like my
Okay.
mom came to Canada in 1969. My dad in 1974.
Okay. Wonderful. So yes, sir. So you stated that you would say yes, that some of our brothers and sisters in Canada suffer from Stockholm Syndrome. You state that some of us up here in Canada have a anything white is right mentality. Could you elaborate?
Yeah, there's some black people up here that definitely just prefer white people and just think they prefer white company. They prefer shopping at white owned businesses. They just think whatever white people do is just better. I wouldn't say it's the majority, but I don't know, there's like a significant minority who think like that, unfortunately.
Okay.
And I give you an example. Like I remember when I was working for our public transit in Toronto. I was doing customer service for them. It's called TTC, Toronto Transit Commission.
Mm-hmm.
And this other black man was telling me how he has a brother who married a white woman, and he asked him, "Why did you marry her?" And he really couldn't give him any other reason, but other than she's white.
Mm. Wow. Well, and we find that sometimes. Many of you may be familiar with Brother Dwayne Omawale. He's a resident historian here at Lumumba Speaks, and of course, he's given a story of situation in Brazil where a brother married a white woman. He had nothing in common with her. They didn't share similar values, educational background. He wasn't even able to have intellectually stimulated conversations with the woman, but married her because she was white and believed that in doing so, that would provide him a level of social status that he did not have as being a black man in Brazil. So this is definitely a global issue, brother, and I appreciate you, of course, highlighting that.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised about Brazil because back in the 30s, their leadership tried to like whiten the country by
Yes,
allowing like millions of European immigrants to come. So I'm not surprised. Unfortunately, some brothers down there have that messed up mentality.
absolutely. And I mean, there was even a policy where they highlighted and of course were pushing miscegenation.
Yo, yeah.
So, that was a major issue. I think it was called bloqueamiento, right? So something to consider. So what are some solutions to this issue, brother? If you could come up with some solutions, I don't know, I'm putting you on the spot, asking you to speak extemporaneously about
Oh,
this.
it's okay.
But if there was a solution, what would it be?
Um, the main thing, man, we have to develop black countries. We have to like believe in ourselves, and the only way to believe in ourselves is like to see like our own black majority countries actually thrive. Like we don't really, there's not one black country that's like a first world country. I feel like that affects like our confidence as a people.
No, wait,
I would
let's
say.
use the term. Let's use the term "developed nation" rather than first world. Let's use the term "developed nation." We
Fair
know that
enough. Fair enough.
that terminology developed during the Cold War. But go right ahead, brother.
Yeah, like we really need to like get our own affairs in order for us to have confidence in ourselves. I would say.
Okay, okay, very good, very good. And I take it you are a lifelong resident of Canada.
Yeah, yeah, I am
Okay,
born and raised.
I wish we had connected before, so we could have connected in person when I went to Toronto. That'd have been great.
Yeah, I started watching you. I'd say probably half a year ago. Just
Okay,
randomly. I think I found you from. Oh, I found you from watching Search for a Hoodoo Divest.
got you. Okay,
Yeah,
okay. Okay. Very good. Very good. Well, I appreciate you tapping in, brother. So you're arguing that one of the things that we can do to combat this concept of Stockholm syndrome, so for Black people, African people, irrespective of where we are in the world, to see an African or Black nation become a developed nation.
yeah. I'll give you an example. So this is back when I was in high school. There was this other black man I knew who was of Trinidadian descent.
Mhm.
He was mostly of African descent, but I think he had some like Indian ancestry. And like I remember one time in front of like everybody, he was like denouncing Africa, calling it dirty, calling it backwards. And it was just so embarrassing. He was saying, "Oh no, I don't claim Africa, I claim India instead." I'm
Mm,
looking at this man like you look majority African. And it's like so I just feel like if we, had some countries that were more developed, we wouldn't have that issue as much.
mm. Okay. All right. And Brother Kevin states Botswana is a pretty developed as a nation. I think part of the issue also is psychological, right? Because we understand the propaganda that's pushed right about Africa and about African people, but I think also of a person, irrespective of the conditions that Africa is in, and I'm not dismissing what you're arguing, but I think there is was credence to what you're saying. We still will find individuals who hate themselves, right?
Yeah.
So I think that is something to consider as well. But Brother Kevin, I hope you could tap in. Sister Shy, love you to tap in. Sister Gloria Coleman, want you to tap in as well as Brother Haru. Would love for you all to tap in, be part of the conversation, and let's discuss how we can combat Stockholm syndrome. Since many argue that, of course, this is the case. Of course, I had this. Just give you a little backstory. I was having a conversation with a colleague yesterday about, of course, hey, Stockholm syndrome. Got the idea and said, let's do a show tomorrow addressing this issue. Right? Do African people suffer from Stockholm syndrome? So something to
Yeah.
consider. I would say yes. I would argue, just in terms of my own upbringing, that part of it I think is due to the education. Right? When I think one of the brothers mentioned from the religious standpoint. And as I stated, oftentimes you're not taught these type of things when you're growing up. If you are a child in a religious institution that is not African, they're not going to give you the history of this religion's oppression of African people. I mean, they wouldn't do that because that works against their own self-interest, right? And so
No,
I
that is so true. The education. I can speak to that in Canada. Like the education because so the biggest minority group in Canada are the indigenous. They're about like 5, 6% of the population. And like when we were growing up and we were taught about what happened between them and the white people, it's just like our history books makes it seem like the Europeans are just absolute heroes. And
Mhm.
it's almost like they were helping the indigenous.
Right. And I mean that, and that's the road. I mean, we talk about once again that the concept of the racial contract. Part of the goal is to what ensnare the victims of the contract into becoming willing participants of and defenders of its cause. And so, one of the things that I think we talk about them do rather well is that they will do you harm like an abuser, right? And then try to say that in abusing you, they're trying to help you.
Yep.
I mean, literally, right? So we're talking about straight up psychotic, abusive type of mentality and behavior.
Nah, for sure. Quick question: like, how bad would you say Stockholm syndrome is among Black Americans?
Well, we like to use the term African Americans here
Okay,
at
sorry.
the
Ah,
one that speaks and Big Line Network. So I would say it's extremely prevalent. Harvard University they did an implicit bias test years ago, of course, in which it showed that I think about 75 to 80% of Black people here in the States had a pro-white, anti-Black disposition. Of course, this aligns, of course, with the work of William Cross and Nigressen's theory, right? He believes that most Black people, unfortunately, have a pro-white, anti-Black disposition, and that they have to face some type of racially traumatic experience that will lead them to not only develop a healthy racial identity, but even begin to even think about what it would mean to view the world from a Black or African perspective. We talk about the doll test, right? Kenneth and Mamie Clark, of course, part of the we're talking about Brown v. Board of Education, Kenneth and Mamie Clark, their doll test. That was one of the monumental form of pieces of evidence that led to, of course, school desegregation. But that's a whole other conversation about how they segregated schools. But there was a victory that you could tell a person about, but not even show you because schools are still segregated to this day. But there was a sister in Harlem, New York City. Shout out to Harlem, who redid the doll test in 2005, and of course had the same results, right? And so I would argue that Stockholm syndrome is extremely prevalent. We could talk about, the stereotype or, one of the issues that we find in the mainstream about, successful Black men pursuing, of course, white women. We could even see in terms of our sisters, not only idealizing, but seeking to emulate white beauty standards.
yeah, the weaves, the blonde hair.
Yes, absolutely. So all of that, I think, is an example of Stockholm syndrome, in which you're not only identifying with the oppressor class, but you're also even defending it, right? And so these are some issues that, unfortunately, we have in our community. And of course, we were seeking to have a conversation this morning, well, it's morning here, of course, afternoon where you are, regarding what are some pragmatic, tangible ways that we can combat this issue, because we know if a person isn't proud of who they are, there's no way they can even envision what actual freedom and liberation will look like.
Yeah, I feel like this might be an interesting take, but I feel like a lot of those like FBAs, those foundational Black Americans, kind of have like Stockholm
Oh
syndrome.
yeah,
Like
absolutely,
a lot of
absolutely.
the points they make are like I don't know how to explain. They're damn near like white supremacist
Yes,
points. Like
yes, yes.
so they'll make these like weird jokes about Africans, and it's like
Oh yeah,
man, that's
yeah.
your
Absolutely. Yeah, I've always, and I'm glad you brought that up, brother. I've always made the argument that this is a form of pseudo intellectual anti-Africanism. One is seeking to not only distance themselves from their African heritage, but also identify, of course, with the oppressor state. Of course, when I always talk about, the only thing foundational about America is settler colonialism, genocide, and chattel enslavement, right? So,
exactly.
so, but this is this concept of what we would like to call, and I think once again, Brother Dwayne Omawale, who of course is a resident historian here at the Lumumba Speaks of Equal Line Network, calls it militant integrationalism. Right, this form of militant integrationism, and also you can even make the argument of seeking to out the white man and his wife. We could be more xenophobic than the white man and his wife. We could be more anti-black and anti-African than the man and his wife, right? We could be more ultra conservative than a white man and his wife. And in doing so, is a belief that somehow they will be able to extract a portion of the privilege and benefits given to, of course, the oppressor class here in America.
Yeah, it's the truth, but it's like you're always disposable. You're never
Yes,
they'll never truly accept you. They'll use you for whatever purpose they have, and then just chuck you away when it's the most convenient.
absolutely. And I think part of this also speaks to the fact that I would argue many of the individuals who are part of that that mindset are intellectually lazy. They tend not to have a working knowledge of history. I've had conversations with many of these individuals, and you're just left puzzled. Like, this is
Yeah,
one.
I saw your conversation with that idiot Afro Elite. Like
Yeah,
that
yeah,
guy is one of those pseudo intellectuals. Like he has
yeah.
no understanding of history. It was
It's
insane.
whatsoever. I was shocked. It was, and of course, there was a scene in the video, and of course, I was still a rookie in these YouTube streets at the time, right?
Yeah,
But I'm, of course, far more refined now. But I was shocked by the fact that he did not have a care or concern for the fact that he were making claims that were adverse to facts. And of course, when I finished that live, I had a conversation with a couple of elders in my personal elders council, and they said, "Yeah, Bakari, that's very prevalent on YouTube. That people will bloviate, they will resort to histrionics, and they don't care if what they're saying is factual or not." And they said, you have to think about the fact that there's a difference for you. You are an academician, you are a professional, you are intellect, you actually have a doctorate, a PhD, and so the standard, right, is different.
yeah. You're right. They don't read books.
I'm sorry.
Like they don't read books. You can just tell they don't read books. They just get information from the internet, from random websites.
Yeah, and so that's a big issue as well. I always tell people, and of course, I got this quote from, of course, Brother Bequaline, and that is, I tell people all the time, we don't do liquor store scholarship here at Lumumba Speaks and Bequaline Network, right? The other issue is, I mean, even if you don't read books, even though we would advocate that you do, read peer-reviewed articles from academic journals, right?
Yes.
Try to, at the very least, review information from a reputable source, right? From a reputable source. That's all I ask, right? Unfortunately, that doesn't happen. Brother Kevin, aka Mr. K, argues there's also that self-defeatist mentality as a result of that Stockholm syndrome that would cause them to live by the motto: if you can't beat them, anti-black oppressors, join them. I would agree 100%, brother. That goes back to, of course, the racial contract. Our good friend Charles Mills, where he argues what part of that the process of the victims of the racial contract is what self-loathing, right? Racial deference, right? To, of course, anti-black oppressors. So great point there, brother Kevin. This is why I push for the brothers and sisters to tap in, because what happens is, I always argue, and in the black community, we have a number of individuals who I argue are organic intellectuals, right? You may not have mastered the academic verbiage, right? Or mastered the language, but based on what? Observable reality, the issues that we face as a people and what's going on.
No, exactly.
Yeah. So I definitely, but once again, I would agree with you, particularly in terms of FBA. We start to find like this militant rejection of an African identity. That some of the arguments are that we are indigenous, which of course is nonsensical.
Oh God, I hate that so much, man. Like I like, they'll say like, I don't look like no African. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, yeah. So
Oh
all of
my
that, I think,
God.
is an example of not only Stockholm syndrome, but once again, a desire to distance oneself, to go through to engage in a process of self-abnegation, the distancing, right, of
Yeah.
oneself from one's own history, heritage, and culture, due to the belief, of course, a misnomer, of course, a prevaricating belief that if I am somehow able to distance myself from an African identity, and we find this is what people call escapism. We see this all the time, right? People believe they can escape the vicissitudes of being in the West by what? Moving into a predominantly white neighborhood, having, of course, biracial children, right? Changing the inflection or tonality of their voice, right? These are all forms of escapism, right? And of course, we can argue that they derive, of course, not only from the racial contract, but also are a symptom of Stockholm syndrome.
Nah, 100% for sure.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Uh,
Absolutely.
Also, those also I was gonna mention too, like Black Hebrew Israelites with their weird, just wanting to be Jews. I never
Yes,
really
well,
understood.
well, and I'm sorry, brother. Somebody mentioned something about the religion issue, and I'm trying to see if I can find that quote. Okay, go right ahead. It was brother Kevin, but go right ahead.
Yeah, I don't know. I always just found them extremely odd. They're up here in Toronto too. They'll frequently set up in random places and be preaching too. And it's just um yeah, it's just like they have complete Stockholm syndrome. They want to reject Africa and then act like the cosplay as Jewish people.
Brother, I have to say I love the term cosplay. Actually, my some of my students made me aware of what cosplaying was about 2 years ago. I was like, "What is cosplaying?" They had to break it down for me in a great deal of
Yeah,
detail. So I appreciate you using that term, what do you mean, pop culture term, right? Keep us over
yeah.
here, of course, in the mix, right? But I think you're onto something. My brother is a Hebrew Israelite, right?
Oh, real quick. So is my dad actually.
Okay. Okay. Well, see, one of those things, right? And I always tell people that, and I even shared this with one of my colleagues the other day, where I said one of the yes, okay, Brother Kevin. See, that's why I need you to tap in, Brother Kevin. Brother Kevin, you got to tap in. You got to tap in. But we're going to get to that, right? So one of the issues we find in terms of the unhealthy uh, aspects of Black people, African people practicing anti non-African religions, particularly Abrahamic religions, is this concept that I call identity dysphoria. Right, these religions
Right.
pedestalize and exalt particular cultures that are non-African, and so what happens is there's a belief that if you identify with the culture of the people, you will become closer to God, and you have a better chance at salvation, right? Um, so something to consider there. The Black Asiatics, right? So we know this concept of the Asiatic Black man, right? This comes from
Oh
the
Lord.
right. So we're talking about, of course, this pseudo history that the Nation of Islam teaches. I recall last year, probably around this time last year, I went to a Nation of Islam meeting in Columbus, Ohio. I just said, let me pull up, it's something I do every now and then. And I mean, they were just making all types of claims that were historical. I asked the brother, why do you call yourself the Asiatic Black man? He said, well, brother, you have to understand that at one point, the entire world, the landmass, talking about Pangea, was called Asia. And I said, well, no, brother, it was called Pangea. I said, secondly, if you study history, the first time a landmass was coined or called Asia was when Herodotus did so in the 400s BCE. And he says, well, no, that's white man's history. I said, no, that's actual history.
Well, it's not even just that. Like, 'cause I'm an atheist like you. I believe in evolution. It's like man left Africa 60,000 years ago. Pangea was like millions of years ago.
Exactly. Exactly. So, those type of things, but all of that is rooted in what this goal of trying to distance oneself from African identity. So I'm Asiatic, right? But it also centers on, of course, uh, pedestalizing, of course, Abrahamic religions, because the Abrahamic religions derived from what? Asia, right? So these are things to consider. I think that it does play creates an adverse role. I remember even having a conversation with my mother, love her dearly, right? She's 69 years old, and she said to me, she said, "Well, son, you know that." She said, "Son, you do know that Jewish people are God's chosen people." And I said, "Lord, have mercy, mother." Lord, and I told her what Dr. John Henry Clark said. I said, "Mom, mother, if God has a chosen people, that means God is a bigot."
For sure.
This is what Dr. John Henry Clark says in his book, uh, Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust, right? So I said, no. I said, once again. So I think the point that, Brother Kevin is making, the point that you're making, Brother Canada, is that we're getting hit from all ends. Right? So, I mean, we're catching it from everywhere. I always, when I would work with my students, I would use an analogy of playing chess. Right, I play chess. There's a great scene in one of my favorite childhood movies, which is Independence Day. So I'm dating myself. Shout out to the summer of '96, right? Where uh, one of the characters says, "It's like chess. You strategically set up your pieces, then at the proper time you strike." And we're seeing that with African people. We're catching it economically. We catch it socially, politically, from the criminal justice system or the just us system. We catch it, of course, educationally. Right, we're seeing it religiously. So I've always articulated that anti-black racism is omnipresent, it is ubiquitous, and we face it in every area of human activity.
Yeah, up here in Canada too. I've had quite a few small little racist incidents with white people up here.
Mhm. Yeah,
But
before, I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. Before I went to Canada, before I went to Toronto, I saw that there were a number of race riots in Toronto in the 20th century, early 20th century.
Not even that. Like there's like so Toronto is half of Toronto, half the people in Toronto are foreign born, right? From Africa, Asia, Latin America, honestly all over the world pretty much. And in our schools sometimes, like they're not huge, there'll be small race riots between like different ethnic groups.
Mm,
Like I know, for example, here in Toronto, there are small little race riots in the high schools between the new Tamil immigrants and some of the older Jamaican immigrants.
okay.
Yeah, so Canada's interesting, man.
Wow. Wow. So one of those things, right? So yeah, these are issues that we, of course, unfortunately face as a people. But of course, we want to be solution oriented. So, family, if you're watching on Twitter, you can tap in here. Of course, of
Oh,
course.
also, I got another thing too. We really need to have we gotta try to figure out how to have more control over media because it's like part of a lot of black people going into anti-blackness is like the images they see in the media. So we got to figure out how to clean up our image in the media because it's like what's in the media isn't like the majority.
Hmm. Yeah,
So
that's very true. Yeah, Malcolm talked about the power of the media, right? And that unfortunately, the media was extremely powerful. They had the ability to, of course, make the innocent seem guilty and the guilty seem innocent. So a number of things to consider. Kevin at KMC
oh, I
has.
can I can answer that. So Confederation was in 1867. Confederation being the different colonies come together under one country. So it was 1867.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. And of course, they received their, of course, independence from Great Britain.
Um, Not it wasn't actually. Sorry. It wasn't really okay. That wasn't really independence. That was the forming of the colony. We got independence in different. It's kind of hard to explain to Americans, but we got independence in like it wasn't all at once. It was in like different. It was in like it started in 1931 with the Statute of Westminster, which gave us control over our foreign affairs. That was
Okay.
like 1930s. That's like, for example,
Mm,
um, up until the 1980s, we didn't even have a constitution. Like our constitution was technically still in Britain. So in 1981, we quote unquote repatriated our constitution. I guess so. I guess you could say 1981 is when we got our full independence. It's
okay.
kind of weird because the royal family in Britain, they're still our head of state.
Mm,
It's a weird setup. We're like a what's it called? We're a constitutional monarchy, or yeah.
absolutely.
So yeah, like
Absolutely.
you Americans fought against the British and got your independence, and then the Americans that wanted to stay loyal to the British, they were called the Loyalists. They moved up to Canada, so we kind of remained within the British sphere up until the 80s.
Absolutely. Defender of logic. I don't know why you didn't get the notification. You may want to check and see if you actually have the notification bell clicked for the channel. But either way, hopefully you can tap in and be part of the conversation this afternoon, morning, afternoon, depending on where you are. Absolutely. Yes, so I'm with you. I'm with you 100%. I think this is a major issue that we're facing as a people. And so, Brother Kevin mentioned, of course, Garvey speaking about, of course, the media. So I want to pull up a quote from Garvey in, of course, Philosophies and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, where he states, and he's talking about propaganda here. So I'm actually going to share my screen, family, so that
Yeah.
you can
Okay,
actually
well,
see.
how do you feel about Marcus Garvey and his like I guess his kind of alliance with the KKK? I don't know if alliance is the right word, but
Right.
I guess
Well, so yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that's a great question. Great segue. So I think that's one thing. I would argue that Garvey did not have an alliance with the KKK, but Garvey
okay.
was serious about having as many people as possible who are willing to repatriate to Africa. And so what we find is there have been a number of African people who have sought to say, hey, if you don't want us here, help us go home. right? There's a great book by Dr. Keisha Blaine. She's one of the preeminent Black female historians, right? And she's at Keisha, I'm sorry, I'm trying to pull it up. Keisha, she's one of the preeminent Black female historians, and she is now at the University of Brown University. She's in the Ivy League, but what she is able to do and what she has done, right? Yeah, she's a professor at Brown University, Department of History. Is she wrote a book titled, well, yes, Set the World on Fire, Black Nationalist Women in the Global Struggle for Freedom. And in that book, she talks about these are basically Black women who continued to push for Pan-Africanism after Marcus Garvey's deportation. So we're talking about late 1920s, 1930s, 40s, and of course 50s, before, of course, the Civil Rights Movement. And they even then, they were seeking to have a Mississippi senator, if I remember his name, Mississippi Senator Theodore Bebo, who was a staunch white supremacist from Mississippi, Theodore G. Bebo, a staunch white supremacist. He was a governor of Mississippi, later elected a U.S. senator. He was a demagogue, a filibusterer, and his name was synonymous with white supremacy. They got him to sponsor a bill to try to get the U.S. government to pay for, of course, African people to repatriate. Right, so we find that hey, we're like, hey, if you're serious, you don't want us here, help us get home. And so even Brother Kevin, Mr. K argues, and of course Tony Martin, if many of you are unaware, was the preeminent Garvey scholar globally. He was the preeminent Garvey scholar. He wrote several books on Marcus Garvey. That it was described as just a meeting, not a conversation, not a correlation. So something to consider there.
Okay. Damn.
Yeah.
Oh, just to let your audience know, the KKK had chapters in Canada as well.
Oh,
Mostly,
I don't doubt it.
yeah, but mostly in our province called Saskatchewan.
Mm-hmm.
They mostly targeted Eastern European immigrants, but they're also against like African Americans who moved to Saskatchewan for farming.
Okay, very cool.
Yeah.
So and as you, let me see if I could bring this up some more. So this is, of course, chapter 2, page, I think 15 of Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, where it states Garvey's talking about propaganda, right? And this speaks to Brother Kevin, where he talked about, of course, the power of the media. And Garvey says we are living in a civilization that is highly developed. We are living in a world that is scientifically arranged, in which everything done by those who control is done through system, proper arrangement, proper organization. And among some of the organized methods used to control the world is a thing known and called propaganda. Propaganda has done more to defeat the good intentions of races and nations than even open warfare. Propaganda is a method of medium used by organized people to convert others against their will. We of the Negro race are suffering more than any other race in the world from propaganda. Propaganda to destroy our hopes, our ambitions, and our confidence in self.
100%.
Yes,
Like the last 50 years, the media has been used to completely, like, I would say, destroy the image of African Americans.
absolutely. Well, I would just say Black people globally, right? I mean,
Yeah, for sure, for
it ain't just
sure.
here in the States. I mean, you up there, you know what I'm saying? So yeah, this isn't just here. So absolutely. Absolutely, absolutely. So once again, family, if you're watching, tap in. You're watching, of course, LumumbaSpeaks.com, a Black empowerment initiative where we believe we could gain a competitive advantage by always betting on Black in conjunction with Beacon Line Network, the Pan-African social media extraordinaire, and the home of African-centered news and information. Make sure you are a blessing to the show. You can hit us at Cash App, Lumumba Speaks, Venmo at B Lumumba, and of course, you can help us out via the super chat as well, so that we can continue to bring you not only African centered information, but also Black targeted information as well via independent medium on YouTube.
I think we need more independent Black media outlets like Roland Martin Unfiltered.
Yeah, so I like, so let me say this about Roland Martin Unfiltered. So one, he is a professional, right? He is an actual professional journalist. He went to J school, known as
Yep.
journalism school. He was the former, I think he was editor of the Chicago Defender, the preeminent African American newspaper in the United States. He was editor of the Chicago Defender for 8 years. Of course, he was a contributor on CNN. He had his own show on TV One, which I thought he did a great job. And now, of course, he has his
Yep.
independent network on YouTube, of course, Roll 'em on Unfiltered. One of the things I take issue with Roland Martin is that he, of course, is just Democrat no matter what, extremely left leaning. And oftentimes we could conflate being leftist with being black, right?
Yeah.
What I like about Roland Martin is that he has the facts. He actually does the research and he has the information. So when people come on the platform making claims that are adverse to facts, he's like, no, that is not the case. Where did you get that information from? I can recall there was a situation where this is during Trump's first administration or regime, you can use whatever term you like, where there was a sister on there who was a supporter of Donald Trump. And what ended up transpiring was she said, well, Donald Trump has created the highest pay increase for people in the military. And Roland Martin said, well, no, that's not true. And he said, well, where did you get information? She said, well, Trump said it. He says, well, he may have said that on Twitter, but I had the documentation and the data right here in front of me. That's not the case at all. So unfortunately, all the times, what the benefit of his show is he's able to contradict and of course confront a lot of information, a lot of misinformation that's going around in the community.
Yeah, that's true. But I agree with you though. He's too Democrat focused. It's like
Absolutely.
for black people, I feel like whatever country we live in, we should vote for whatever party is best for our interests,
I
regardless.
would argue, not argue, not even party, right? Because we do know that, as Dr. John, well, one, both political parties are white supremacist organizations. That is a reality. I actually wrote a great article on that topic on Medium. If you all aren't following me on Medium, family, come on now, we gotta hold a brother down, right? Um, So, and I'll put the link, of course, in the chat so you all can follow my meeting. But I'm going to bring this up. I actually wrote an article, and I'm going to get to your comment, Brother Kevin. But I wrote an article addressing this issue, right, on Medium, American politics and how it really works, an examination of the American two-party electoral system. And one of the things I'll talk about, of course, and there's a book. When I was an undergraduate, we had to read a book for a social inequality class titled American Society, How It Really Works by Aaron Olin Wright and Joel Rogers. And what the argument they make is that the same both political parties are funded by the same lobbyists and special interest groups, both BOAF, right? Both, right? Uh, and so the argument is that from aside from thematical issues, they tend to agree on major domestic and foreign policy concerns. For example, both political parties in their respective presidential administrations supported apartheid in South Africa, the end of Reconstruction, the counterintelligence program against civil rights organizations, foreign aid to Israel, and Operation Iraqi Freedom, to name a few. Right. So we find that the reality of the situation is both political parties, of course, are white supremacist organizations. And so I seek to invoke the wisdom, of course, of our ancestor and great Pan African warrior scholar, Dr. John Henry Clark, when he teaches us we have no permanent friends or permanent enemies, only permanent interest.
No, that's fair. Like, do you think you guys can form like a third party, like African Americans, and just kind of like use them to fight for your interests? Because here in Canada, we have a third party called NDP, the New Democrat Party, and for
Okay.
the most part, like up until recently, they were the third biggest party in our parliament, and they were pretty effective in like their main goal was pushing labor rights. They've been
Mm,
pretty effective at that.
okay. Well, we do have the Green Party here in America. The Green Party doesn't get a lot of traction, right, because they aren't funded by, of course, special interest groups. But if you look at the policies of the Green Party, many would argue that not only are they progressive, that they are radical and they are anti-imperialistic and anti-military industrial complex as well.
Yeah.
Yes. DOD, I'm gonna let you tap in, turn your mic on, and share with us your thoughts. DOD. Yes, sir. DOD, if you can unmute yourself. I'm sorry. Go right ahead.
All right, yeah. I think the answer to this question is pretty rhetorical. That's what it's like. That's a pretty obvious yes there, because um, do African people suffer from Stockholm syndrome? I think that the bigger picture there is it's ultimately mind control.
Mm.
You know, it's ultimately mind control in this from the sense that you have a population of people who continue to take actions that go against their own interest but are perceived as intellectual, right?
Could you
So,
provide an example of that?
all right. So, for example, I have a Twitter account where I just engage with people
Yes, sir.
in order to try to get a glimpse of what people are thinking specifically on the continent of Africa. And there was a post that I saw where there was a private mining company from Botswana that had found a very large diamond from the region. And so I'm looking at these comments, and everyone is saying, "Oh, Botswana is winning." But in my mind, is how do you perceive winning from a company that found a diamond that none of you own?
Mm.
So to interpret finding something of value as a win when you do not yourself own it, that to me is a form of a Stockholm syndrome or a mind control ultimately, in the sense that you can celebrate something as a win that has no direct impact on the real life conditions of the people. There's a difference if this mine is discovered, or excuse me, there's a difference if the stone is discovered and then that mine that discovered that stone is then owned either from an African person or from a SOE in which the revenue from that discovery then go to benefit the people. So to ultimately, in simplest terms, to celebrate something that is not yours, to me is a form of that, because then you ultimately um, you you justify, in a sense, exploitation by celebrating something that's not yours.
And, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that speaks to, once again, the racial contract. Charles Mills, this concept of the racial contract, where not only does the racial contract envelop the victims, but it causes us to become some of the most ardent supporters and defenders.
Yeah.
So, I mean, so we talk. I'm glad you tapped in, brother. The psychological aspect of course, the issues that we face, where it's really mind control. And I'm quite sure, because you're a brilliant brother, you're familiar with the term menticide.
Menticide.
Absolutely.
I've never heard of that.
Oh, wow. Well, yeah, it's a great book on menticide. But long story short, menticide is the inability of a person to think objectively, critically, objectively, and independently. Yes,
Wow.
absolutely. Yeah.
Wow. I learned something new today.
Yeah.
Appreciate that.
So, and here's the thing, brother. Many of you all know, of course, I work in higher ed. Um, it is a real issue, right? And
Yeah.
I could say respectfully and humbly that I at one point suffered from menticide. Before I went to college and majored in Black studies, I did not have I was unable to think independently and critically and objectively about the facts of life and the issues that we face as a people.
Yeah. So my question to you then is that if we've come to the conclusion that African people are suffering from Stockholm syndrome, what then is the antidote or the
Oh, well, that's part of it, brother. We want to be solution oriented, so I definitely appreciate you asking the question. So I think it's multifaceted, right? Brother Black Canadian discussed the importance of controlling media. He said
yeah,
that having
that's a big
shows like this are important. I think another aspect, of course, and we, I've pushed this numerous times. I've even done shows with my daughter where we talked about the importance of having African centered Saturday schools. We may not be able to build an actual brick and mortar Monday through Friday educational institution, but at the very least, we can have Saturday schools where the children are able to come in and we focus on some of those foundational aspects of education, reading, writing, arithmetic. But the curriculum is African centered, infuses learning about African history, so culture, so on and so forth. And when we say culture, we're not talking about food and music. Those are things that are fleeting. We're talking about how do we organize ourselves as a people, culturally, politically, economically, so on and so forth.
Yeah, because I think to me that's the ultimate goal, right? To reverse the syndrome in in the minds of millions, because it's the media landscape is ultimately a weapon in essence, right? So um, I view the situation, or I view the way in which worlds engage with one another through the lens of competition. And uh, if you have a person who has Stockholm syndrome, they will ultimately work against their own interest, in the sense that, is it possible? Another example here, and I don't want to step on any toes. Is it possible that Nelson Mandela suffered from a form of Stockholm syndrome?
Ooh, you trying to cause some problems.
Okay.
Okay, hold
But
on.
yo, how so?
Listen, brother, I appreciate you broaching the subject.
Damn.
This is what we're here to do. This is what we're here to do. I appreciate you broaching the subject. So I'm going to allow you to elaborate on the position. Go right ahead.
That's interesting.
In the sense that before Nelson Mandela gets taken to Robben Island,
Yes, sir.
They come to the decision where this peaceful form of engaging with the apartheid government is no longer effective. So then they decide we need to take up arms. During this period, when they make a decision that they need to take up arms, that's when he is then captured via a certain government agency and then taken to Robben Island. The fact that Nelson Mandela comes out a completely different man after spending all of that time,
27 years,
in prison, makes you, I think it's reasonable to suggest that there was some form of, whether knowingly or unknowingly, there was some form of a mental reconditioning in terms of his ethos and what he stood for. Because what's interesting is that as he was in prison, his wife, Winnie Mandela, she was obviously not in prison. And she would try to write him letters to sort of inform him what was going on the inside, in essence, to kind of keep his flame going, right, in the sense.
Absolutely.
And towards the end, when he gets out, essentially all of his economic ideals of, taking back land, nationalizing the mines and resources throughout the region, all of those ideals in which he went into prison with, he now takes a position against. And it is only when they realize, okay, Nelson Mandela, we'll give him to the people to appease the people, but the only reason from their vantage point that they're willing to accept him is because he now has a psychological framework that works against the interest of his own people and in favor of our people. And when I say our people, I'm saying those who are in control of the resources.
You're talking about Afrikaners, absolutely. So,
exactly.
So I would say this. I don't know. Have you? Let me ask you this question. Have you read Nelson Mandela's book, Long Walk to Freedom?
I've probably read about 2 to 3 chapters, but I haven't finished it completely.
Okay. And that's understandable. It is a lengthy text. So I've read the book, and what I would argue is this: one, nobody walks into prison for 27 years and remains the same person that they were after 27
exactly.
years. I just think we got to put that out there, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's number one. Number two, there was an expectation based on, of course, his political views and fervor prior to incarceration that they would nationalize, of course, the industries in South Africa. But if you read Long Walk to Freedom, he discusses that there was a threat that if he were to do that, there would be a global economic boycott of South African industries, right? And that would cripple the economy and really lead the society into, particularly the people, into a situation in which they were destitute and they're now seeking foreign aid to just basic amenities such as feeding themselves. And so I think as a head of state, he was in a position in which really if he would have done that, there was more harm than, and of course this is This is Monday morning quarterback that I'm playing.
Yeah.
But I think he was in a position politically to where doing that was not feasible.
Was it not feasible in the sense that? So let me pose a question to you.
Yes, sir.
Do you think that nations at some point or another have to go through a period of suffering and sometimes loss to achieve ultimate independence?
Yes, sir. I do. But I think so. And the reason why I'm glad you asked that, question. But when we look at nations, particularly from an African frame of reference, who have done that, typically they had someone to support them, right? So we talk about a situation like Ghana, right, or Tanzania or Kenya. They had other African nations who were able to support them financially to make up for that loss, of course, or influx of revenue, right? So, or we talk about even now with Burkina Faso, when the work that Captain Ibrahim Touré is doing, of course, he has support and financial backing from Russia. Right, it's very difficult to do those type of things if you don't have someone. So it's like going to war and you don't have a good supply chain.
Correct.
Right. And I think, once again, that was the position that unfortunately was in. Because if you think about in the 80s and in the 90s, when he was released, Africa was many African nations were facing structural adjustment. And then, of course, the Soviet Union had dissolved. There was the type of global, wouldn't have had the global financial support to make that move. And that's why, I tend to be I tend not to be as harsh a critic of Mandela, because, once again, if we were in a position where we were going to become head of state, and we know, brother, that no one walks out of prison after 27 years, becomes president of a country, unless there's a script and plan behind the scenes. Right?
Exactly.
We know that. That's just a reality. It doesn't happen only in the movies. Right? Only in the movies, right?
But okay, go ahead.
Yes, sir. But as I say that, I think if we look at the broader context of, if he made that move, he wouldn't have had any type of financial backing or support from another nation to actually allow them to basically tread water during that lean time.
Okay, so because there's so many ways that this conversation could go. So let's say Nelson Mandela, he had to, I guess, acquiesce, if you will, or go with their economic framework to avoid large-scale destabilization.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so let's assume that he does that. The problem that now sets is that ultimately South Africans did not make the colonialist surrender. So they did not bring them to a point where they surrendered, and then now the native population set the terms of the future of the nation. It was done via negotiation. So, for example, when the United States of America ultimately defeated Japan, they made Japan surrender, a complete and total surrender.
Right.
To the point where now everything that is done in Japan is done by the administration, by the operations of the United States of America. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that at what point do we say, okay, we've achieved the level of stabilization, and now we say, okay, now we go into a framework of regaining everything that was lost now that we've achieved the stabilization? Because back to the Stockholm syndrome framework, now what you have is you have a perpetual begging of resources from individuals in South Africa. So they'll say, well, if we vote for a certain party, those who are wealthy within the country, they'll take their money and they'll leave the country, and then the country won't develop. So was the conditioning, the psychological conditioning of Nelson Mandela, did that create a precedence of how to behave in relation to capital and foreign investment, which then could ultimately...
I would say this. I would argue that I don't know if he was psychologically conditioned or if he was simply politically being pragmatic.
So when I say conditioned, I don't mean like they sat him in a room and then they put him through some program to recondition him. in a hypothetical way. What I'm saying is human beings, at least from my understanding, we can be influenced in conditions just from our everyday existence.
Okay.
So, for example, if you look at the conditions that they had him in the prison, he was isolated from outside communication, and he
Yes.
could only talk to guards and individuals that he interacted with. To me, that is a form of psychological conditioning
I got you.
because they are now cutting him off from outside communication. Therefore, he's isolated by a group of individuals, which can now shape his mind, his thinking, and his ways of seeing things, in essence.
Right. So
So,
let me ask you this. If you were in the position of Mandela, where you had the chance to become head of state in the early to mid 90s, what economic program would you have brought into fruition?
all right. What I would have done is, and mind you, I need to show a bit of respect here in the sense that we have the advantage of hindsight.
Yes, sir.
He did not have that advantage. So before I pose a possible solution of what would have been done, I need to at least be fair to say that we can now look back and see what was done by the decisions in which he made, and then we can now say, okay, that was wrong. This may have worked. You get what I'm saying? So I just want to be fair there because he's not dealing with the complete deck of cards like we would, like I'm about to. So hindsight, looking back, and to be clear, there's a myriad of ways that this problem could be solved. But just to answer the question, what I would have done personally is I would have either just simply warned the people of what's about to happen. I would have engaged the populace to say, hey, do you guys want to see this completely through, or or do you want to just acquiesce? Simply, do you want reform, or do you want a complete overhaul of the system? Now, because I think it's important in that sense, because once people are aware of what they're about to go through, it becomes a lot easier for them to bear with it. But from an economic standpoint, I would have nationalized the mines. And immediately after I would have nationalized the mines, I would have then completely changed the education system of the region. So instead of being a much more gradual K through 12 type of education, I would have instantly instituted a vocational style of learning, so that I would have raised a population of people who would have known how to run and operate these mines.
So you're talking about Booker T. Washington style?
Exactly.
Okay. So let me ask you a question, and I appreciate your answer. How do you address because you have people working the mines. What do you do in response to the global boycott against South African industries as a result of that nationalization?
Now that right there,
and that's the issue.
Yeah. Because that creates an entirely new dynamic. And ultimately, this just boils down to the grip that the West has had on African economies. Ultimately, when they've literally cornered every market, they have basically, the way that I would put it is, because I've thought about this before, and I don't play chess, but when I look at it from a chess perspective, the West, in a way, has created an economic system where African economies, for the most part, are in a perpetual checkmate. So it's like whichever direction they turn, there's going to be a checkmate there. So you either have two options at that point. One, you go around the world and you meet other nations to see if you can develop some type of trade deals, or you try to figure out an economic mechanism that allows you to function within a self-contained ecosystem, right? So, for example, after the American Revolution, the United States of America breaks away from Britain. And up until that point, they then have to create a self-contained economic system because they went to war against the British for their independence. And now they have to figure out, okay, without the assistance and the help from Britain, how do we now create a new economic model that allows us to thrive on our own without
Right.
outside assistance. And that's where you get the establishment of the Bank of New York from, I think, from Alexander Hamilton. They coined their own money, and they essentially create a self-contained economic machine. So
Right.
that would have been a possible option. So, and again, I'm not saying that I know.
Well, real quick, but we know when we talk, what we're talking is a global form of white hegemony. So it wouldn't just be one nation that we're fighting against. We're fighting against a global economy, right? So we're producing. So we nationalized, and I'm not, arguing that I agree with what Mandela did. I'm just, providing the context. We nationalize the industries. We're still producing these natural resources, right? These luxury goods, diamonds, gold, et cetera, et cetera. But now, based on the nationalization, the market, right, the countries that purchase these items won't buy them from us. So now what do we do? And that's what he was up against. I can nationalize the industries, and we produce these products, and we have no one to sell it to.
Well, I wouldn't say no one, because not at that point in time, there were some countries who were not necessarily completely integrated into that Western system. So you may have had, per se, the Soviet Union.
Well, remember the Soviet Union had capitulated, right? So the Eastern Bloc had actually dissolved.
And then what about China then? Could they not have created trade deals with China?
They probably could have, but if you recall, at that time, China wasn't a superpower, and they didn't have the economy that they have now back in the 90s.
Yeah. So it's, again, these are tough questions.
Yes.
And I think they're not, I don't want to sit here and act like I have all the answers, because I don't. There's a lot of stuff that I'm completely ignorant to. But at the same time, is at some point, let's assume then your line of reasoning, if we take your position to its logical conclusion, the question I want to ask now is there ever a time then that Africa will have complete and total economic freedom from the Western economic framework?
Well, that is the hope and desire.
I mean, Africa has to industrialize. That's like the first step there.
That is the desire. I just argue. I think Mandela was between a rock and a hard place in that situation. He could have nationalized, but he would have found himself in a situation where there would have been a global North boycott of South African products. And one of the reasons why the apartheid regime was able to remain power for so long was, one, they had a number of allies in the global North, particularly the United States, that refused to actually engage in an economic boycott of South Africa. Even when they had the whole discussions about the ending of apartheid, F.W. de Klerk said, "Well, we're not going to put ourselves in a position where we lose power. The hell will we do that?"
So my question to you then is that a result then of pan-Europeanism versus pan-Africanism?
Yes, sir. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's a great point. Yes, absolutely. They work together. That's just the reality of the situation. I mean, and there are historical examples of that. When the Japanese defeated Russia in the first Sino-Russian War, Australians then said, "Well, Australia for the Australians," started, of course, advocating solidarity with white people globally. Right? So we see that this happens whenever there's really even perceived Black progress or African progress, we find that it's followed by periods of racial retrenchment.
Okay. So do you think then it would be possible now, due to the fact that China is a far more established economy, so you could, engage in some type of global trade there, and then you have some of the global South countries in South America who have created some form of trade agreements through BRICS. Do you think, basically the question I have is, to simplify and get to the point, do you think it would be possible now for African continents to nationalize and do it successfully?
I certainly hope so. I certainly hope so. I believe that's what's taking place in Burkina Faso, and from the reports that I've received, is going well, and that they're using the proceeds to actually, of course, create infrastructure projects to better the material conditions of the people in the country. And
Mhm.
so, my desire, my hope is that continues to take place.
Yeah, because this, going back to the topic of conversation here with the Stockholm syndrome, I just don't like seeing individuals like vote against their own interest,
Yes, sir.
and then they see it as some type of uh, ingenious thought. It's like,
Could you provide an example of that?
okay, let me see. So, for example, during the South African elections, there were people who were afraid of the ANC aligning with a black liberation movement. I think
Okay.
it's called like the EFF or something like that. So I'm not sure, but there were black people who were saying, "Look, we just want jobs. We don't care who's in power.
Mm-hmm.
We just want jobs. Just give us jobs, and we'll vote for whoever gives us jobs." And in my mind, I said, okay, I'm going through this Twitter feed just to get a pulse of what people are thinking on the ground. And all I see is just jobs. We want 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 jobs. And in my mind, I'm thinking, I said, this is all you guys want? Like, why is
Right.
there no conversation about ownership?
Right.
Why is there no conversation about, we want to maintain the resources and make sure that the wealth that is generated from those resources work in behalf of the people? Why is it only jobs? And then I started noticing that individuals were afraid of, well, if we vote for this party, they call it, I think they call this thing like white capital or something. They say that capital will leave the country, and then we won't be able to develop. So when I say that, that's one example. There's another example where it just came to my mind. I forgot it. But there's another example where that's one that I could think of right now,
Okay.
for sure. Essentially, instead of advocating for ownership, they were advocating for jobs. And the second example, it just came back to my memory. Between these groups of political parties in South Africa, so you got the ANC, you have the EFF, and I think the other one is the DA. Here's a clear example of Black people appearing, professing themselves to be genius, but they vote against their own interest. Essentially, you have the DA who was interested in removing power from the ANC, right? But I would also hear arguments of EFF wanting the same thing, and that to me was a concern, because I was like, okay, you have two different political parties, the DA and the EFF, and they both want to get rid of the ANC. So as I'm looking at this, I was like, okay, it's two separate parties who have two completely different ideologies, but on this issue of the ANC, they agree. So from a strategic standpoint, I looked at this and I was like, why do you guys want the same thing that they want? And who benefits from that ultimate destruction of the ANC? And then now look at the outcome of the election. Both the DA and the EFF wanted to remove the ANC or diminish their power, but in the end, the DA won. So you got two groups of people, and the EFF were saying, hey, we need to get rid of the ANC, because once we get rid of the ANC, we'll be able to enact policies such as land reform and all these things. But I was like, well, the DA wants the same thing you want. So if both of these political parties want the same thing, who wins in the end? And ultimately, the DA won.
Mm-hmm.
Because once the EFF contributed to the demolition, if you will, of the ANC in terms of their political stronghold, the DA was able to come in and usurp them and take that position and now get into the government. But if you listen to EFF commentators, they would always say, oh, this is such a genius idea. Once we get rid and diminish power from the ANC, we'll then be able to go in and do whatever. But that wasn't the case. So that's a perfect example of DA wants the same thing that the EFF wants. But in that situation, the EFF wants it, but they don't realize that once that void is filled, the DA then takes that position. So they were parroting it on the internet and all through interviews, like, oh, this is what we need to do. But in the end, who won?
Mm.
Well, you both wanted the same thing. You both, and so ultimately it appeared to be a genius move. Oh, we can't wait to celebrate once we destroy the ANC. But in my mind, I was like, okay, so you have black people saying that they want to destroy the only power stronghold they have left.
Mm.
You see, so I think to me, that's a prime example there where they were, got to get rid of ANC, got to get rid of ANC, got to get rid of ANC. And they voluntarily would bash the ANC. In my mind, I was like, why not figure out a way to generate some type of alliance? Because now, once you diminish ANC now has to choose between EFF or DA, and they chose the white party, DA. So EFF ultimately lost. So
Gotcha.
I hope that's a clear. I hope that's a much better.
Yeah. Absolutely, 100%. I appreciate you sharing that, brother. Black Canada, Black Canadian 9-3. Any thoughts?
Not at the moment. Not at the moment. Just listening.
Okay. Very good. Very good. Very good. Well, once again, DOD, I'm happy you tap back in. Hopefully you could be a frequent and regular contributor, of course, to the platform. But I think this, of course, speaks to Stockholm Syndrome. And you've stated this, we've seen this on a number of occasions, not only on the continent, but even here in the West, where you have individuals who I would argue maybe are pseudo-intellectuals who believe that it's somehow pivoting and aligning themselves with the interests of those who are in power, who have oppressed us, that somehow this is some type of ingenious political strategy that's supposed to somehow help us. And I think what the reality situation oftentimes is, and of course you could push back against this, is that what's really taking place is these are individuals who are seeking to ingratiate themselves with individuals that they believe have power and resources, not, of course, working to the benefit, of course, of the masses of our people.
I mean, case in point is Glenn Lowry. I don't know if you've heard about his story recently. He was is a black guy that used to work at the Manhattan Institute, and he was basically on the media train of just utterly destroying the image of black people, and saying that black people need to get over slavery, quit holding on to the past, and all these different. I mean, he was basically the. He shared an ideological view similar to that of Candace Owens. And unfortunately for him, they paid him a hefty salary once he was speaking ill about black people. But
absolutely, that's what happens. Yeah.
But there was a certain topic that he could not touch, which I'm sure you could read between the lines of what that is. And they got rid of him once he started speaking on certain issues that weren't prevalent to black people, and he started going after, started challenging a certain group of people. And then once he did that, then that's when they said, all right, Negro, you step aside, your services are no longer needed here. And that's ultimately what happened to him. So speaking to the issue of serving his own interest. So they paid him a very good salary while he was there at the Manhattan Institute. And as long as he spoke a certain thing and told a certain line and took his frustration towards a certain group, they were completely okay with financing that and paying his salary.
Yes, we saw that with Candace Owens, yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Her with Daily Wire.
Yeah, so speaking to your point of self-serving interest.
Yes.
It's like you're serving your own interest, but you're still being used.
Yeah, right.
Which then leads to the further verification there of the Stockholm syndrome. It's like, but in your mind, you believe that you're a free thinker. So, or this person that has a unique and independent view, when in reality you're a tool.
Right. Yes, and you're just parroting, views of those who are opposed, who are actually going to argue our mere existence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and one last question I'd like to ask you before we leave here is, what role do you believe that psychological dependency plays in Stockholm syndrome, and how does that psychological dependency then correlate between the Stockholm syndrome of the people as a whole? Speaking specifically to psychological dependency, how does that play? What role does that play within Stockholm syndrome?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I wasn't prepared for it, but so I'm gonna speak to this really extemporaneously. But I think that's the crux of Stockholm syndrome is to what? Socialize a person to become psychologically dependent. And then what you can do is you can flambe, you can flip the person, you could grill them, you could saute, you can fry them, right? You could bake them, and they will believe that this is of their own volition.
Mm.
That's what I mean. There are examples of this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and to the point to where they would then act in a manner that is against their own best interests and believe that they're doing so what a free will.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's topics like this, man. It's Lee.
Yeah.
It just makes it because that's like it's one thing to be psychologically conditioned, for 5, 6 years, 10 years, but imagine being psychologically conditioned for centuries.
Mm-hmm.
How do you overcome that? You know,
Right.
like is it even? I don't think it'd be possible within our lifetime to witness that for sure. But how do you even go about creating a way to even break? That's a lot of years of psychological conditioning, man.
Absolutely.
And then it's passed on epigenetically from generation to generation to the point where is it to the point where this psychologically dependency is now passed down.
Well, yeah, oftentimes it is, but I think
Mm-hmm.
also what we have to consider is, the concept of reach one, teach one. I mean, I am a great example of someone who grew up in a household where I would argue, of course, my family was conditioned to be psychologically dependent, like the majority of Black people, of a
Mm-hmm.
Black household. However, my ability to go to college, of course, and major in Black studies,
Mm-hmm.
allowed me to be able to break that dependency. Then, of course, raise my children in a manner in which they would be African centered and unapologetically African at an early age.
Yeah. So I guess the next question we'll probably have to save for another time is that how do we do that at scale?
Right. Yes. And so that's something that we discussed as well. First off, I got to ask you, but do you have an economic background, financial background?
No, not an economic background, but financial in a way. Yeah, but I don't have no background in economics or anything like that. No.
Okay. So that's typically a term that people would use in terms of, to scale. So I would say one of the ways is, and we talked about this and we've done this on a number of occasions. And Brother Kevin just put this in the chat. Must reads about Stockholm syndrome. I appreciate that, Brother Kevin. So I'm definitely going to check that text out.
Good recommendation there.
Yes, is Saturday schools, right?
Mm-hmm.
We may not have the capacity to develop, independent K through 12 brick and mortar educational institutions, but what we can do is create Juma Mosi Shule Saturday schools. I was part of the West Dayton Youth Task Force in Dayton, Ohio, where we ran the Juma Mosi Shule every Saturday from 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. Students would come in, they will receive breakfast, they will receive, of course, tutoring, reading, writing, arithmetic, African-centered instruction, African history. They would play chess. There would be some games, and then, of course, we would end with them having lunch.
To add
Actually,
to that,
I know of oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, you can go ahead.
No, I was gonna say I know of a brother in New York City who has a program like that. It's like an after school program where he teaches kids like STEM. So yeah.
Okay. Because Garvey did something that hasn't really been replicated in the sense of the amount of subscribers that he had to his publication.
Right.
Paid subscribers, not just YouTube subscribers that equate to views. Hundreds of thousands of paid subscribers.
Right.
And what I find fascinating is how Garvey was able to capture the minds of the people. Because once you've captured the minds of the people and you've captured their attention, you can now disseminate ideas that can inspire them for legitimate independence. And what I find interesting is that I've yet to find a single Black publication that has surpassed his actual paid subscription, even in the modern context, even with modern technology. There's not been an independent Black publication that has been able to surpass his paid subscribers. The numbers of his, I think it was in the multiple, there's a few 100,000 people who were paid subscribers of his publication. And the amount of circulations that they would have in a given week or in a given month, these numbers were huge. And I think that is the bedrock of Garveyism, right? So if he's not able to communicate his ideas to the masses and galvanize Black people as a whole around the country and then eventually around the world, he is not able to create a mechanism where he could raise capital to effectively then adventure off into industry.
Right.
So the publication ultimately finances the operations of the early stages of the movement. And then he goes to different forms of raising capital to go on to do industrial things. And so I just find it odd that those numbers in terms of paid subscriptions hasn't been surpassed, which goes to show you what he pulled off was pretty impressive. in terms of the media side of things and the publications, because those publications go from people paying for the publications to get them, and then also becoming paid members of that movement as well. So what he pulled off, and that I believe that's the starting point to the antidote of the Stockholm syndrome. Is it possible to get some type of publication or media entity that can be in the hands of millions of Black people around the world, but leveraging technology? Because now we don't have to buy a printing press and then buy paper and then buy ink and then run it through the printing press and then have these publications physically transported to different parts of the world. Now, with a certain platform and basic technology, you can distribute your ideas of Pan-Africanism to millions of people across the planet. Yes. And if Garvey can pull off multiple hundreds of thousands of subscribers on a monthly basis, paid subscribers on a monthly basis, the question is, how is it that with much better technology, those numbers have yet to be replicated?
Yeah, got a great point.
Which then is the antidote to the Stockholm syndrome, because ultimately Stockholm syndrome derives from messaging, experiences, interactions with other humans. So the way you can at least start to chip away at that psychological conditioning is to have messaging that counters the messaging of the individuals that are implementing the Stockholm syndrome. And in media publications is one way to do that.
Absolutely. But family, hey, brother, I appreciate you. You know, you're always welcome. Till next time, family, make sure you always bet on Black. Peace.
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 Before you go, make sure you hit the subscribe and like button. Thank you for supporting the channel. And remember, here at Lumumba Speaks, we always bet on Black. Peace.